Okay, so welcome to SQLtraining.co.uk's very first video blog. Most of my blogs, to be honest, are written, but recently I had done a few blogs that one of the clients actually said would be quite useful to be seen in a video. I kind of thought, well, the web exists, I have a YouTube channel, might as well use it. So here we go. This is going to be the first one, and ironically, there's going to be a lot less SQL than you might expect. I would imagine a lot of the future ones are going to be very, very SQL based, but this one actually not so much. In fact, majoritively it will be in a PowerShell window. But never mind. I'm sure we'll all get over that in time. So, what was I actually asked about? Well, I was on site with the client and they were kind of trying to do some sort of upgrade testing. They wanted a stable environment for devs to use. They didn't want to have to install multiple SQL servers everywhere, so I was trying to introduce them to Docker. Now, the whole idea of Docker is obviously that it's just containers, so everything is kind of self-contained in its own little unit. You don't have to kind of fully install it like you would do other software, and it's actually pretty flexible and pretty funky. So I was kind of showing them how Docker worked, a few commands, kind of how to get SQL Server up and running, how to get a database on it, play with it a bit. And I documented it all for them, and they decided that the documentation would again be far better in a video. So here we are. Now, I'm not going to kind of go through the install of Docker. Kind of think that's a bit redundant because it's pretty easy to do. However, what I will do is tell you kind of how to get it and where from. So we do have Docker itself. Just stick in Docker Desktop for Windows. This presumes you're on Windows, obviously. And you will come to this page, which obviously, as you can see, has a good old Get Docker Desktop for Windows. Lots of clickable things. You click them, it will download, and it will install. The word will be good. So once installed, because I already have it, so I'm just going to boot up Docker Desktop. And what it will do is disappear immediately because it appears down here. There we go. In a tiny little thing that looks like a whale. And it will sit there and it will trundle away. You can see its Docker is starting. So we have Docker. World is good. Now, the next thing we're going to do is, whilst we've got Docker now installed on our system, Docker is basically just the engine. It's just the framework that runs containers. So in order to get a container running, we need an image. So it's kind of like just getting an ISO, you know, where you'd normally go download an ISO. Nowadays you can just tell Windows to mount the ISO and then you just run it as if it's a CD. So we're going to do a similar thing. With Docker, you go get an image and you download the image and then it boots it up as a container. So the one I'm actually going to use is SQL Server for Linux, because it's far more fun to run a Linux box on a Windows machine, just because it sounds absurd. So we're going to do SQL Server for Linux on a Windows box. Now, my Docker is nicely started. So if I kind of right click it, you'll see here we have these little kind of options. One of them, you'll see there, it says switch to Windows containers. We're not going to do that. We're going to leave it as is, which is the default, which is on Linux container. And the reason we're going to leave it is because we're doing a Linux SQL Server, so we need the Linux container to run it because it's basically emulating Linux. So we're going to leave that alone. So as long as yours says switch to Windows containers, you're good. If it says switch to Linux containers, click it. Simple as. So what we do is we basically pull down an image. Okay, so as you can see here, I'm going to get the 2019 latest version, so you can see they've got the command here, docker pull mcr.microsoft.com MS SQL blah 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 19 latest. As a quick thing, in case anyone wants to pause and grab it, that is where you find them. Obviously Google gets you here, so I don't want to dwell too much. And as you can see here, we've actually got a copy and paste pull if we really want to. So I'm going to go into my PowerShell because I like PowerShell. You can do all this in the DOS command shell if you really want. I just like PowerShell. It has pretty colours. So we're going to stick the command in and we do run. This will then go away and get whatever it needs to do now. I've already got the latest one. I play with this quite a lot. But for anyone who's getting it for the first time, it's about a 1 gig download. Takes a while. Not too bad. It's pretty sharpish. But once you've already got it, you can then just check for the latest updates. It will only download the bits it needs really, really quick. So you can kind of get like a latest version in like a couple of minutes as long as you've already got the base file. So now we have that. What we're going to do now is we are going to basically run it. And it's kind of like an install. So I'm just going to paste this in here. Now, what you can actually see is I'm just running a simple Docker command. Looks more complicated than it is. If you break it down, Docker run, so we're just going to run, and we're going to run a container, which is basically we're going to run the image. So you can see on the end, mcr.microsoft.com 2019 latest. That's our image. So we're running that. We're going to name it SQL 2019 Linux. Always good to give a container a name, otherwise it gives it some sort of weird kind of GUID hash value, and it's very annoying to work with. Much easier to give it a nice name. So we're just going to give the container a name, SQL 2019 Linux. Next thing is it says accept the EULA. That basically just says, have you got a license? Now, as default, these all boot into the developer edition, so you don't need a license. I mean, don't run them in production, then you don't need a license. So the reason we just put that in and put yes is because it's actually a stoppable thing. It will actually stop the install to ask you and say put in a yes, no. Obviously, therefore, if you don't pass anything in, this just stops in the background. It's not a two-way discussion, so it doesn't ask you to then go, do you accept this, yes or no? So if you don't put it in at the start, world goes bad. So just type that in. Then the SA password. Now, you need a strong password. If it breaches the guidance around passwords, it won't actually let you in once it's installed it, which is a little bit irritating. So just make sure it's a nice, silly password. Mine is obviously not a very good password, but we're going with it. And then the only other bit you need to know about this command is the -p. The -p is just a port map inside the container, because you've got to remember a container is a self-contained thing, so it's almost imagine it kind of like its own operating system, so kind of like a VM. So SQL Server inside that container will run on port 1433, as it does with all systems. However, on my desktop, I already have SQL Server installed, and many of them, so I use port 1433. So I'm just going to map a port that isn't in use through to 1433 within the container. So if I call anything from my desktop on port 14330, it will send it through to the container as port 1433, which is the SQL Server port, which means it will then go straight to SQL Server. I hope you are following that. I talk quite quickly, but you know, you'll get the idea. So I'm just going to run that. And now what you see is just some weird squiggle that comes back. That basically now means that it is running a container. That is it. SQL Server 2019 is now running in Linux on my Windows desktop. That's it. Done. It's now running in the background. All is good. Obviously, no one's ever going to believe that, so we can test it. So, what I'm going to invoke is the command shell. SQL CMD runs inside the 2019 Linux, so we can actually access that. And as you can see here, all we're doing is the server is localhost because it's installed on my machine in a container, but it's still on my machine, so it's still localhost. User is SA. The password is the password I specified just above. And the only other thing we need to know is docker exec just means execute, and the -it is basically, it's not exactly what it actually means, but effectively the best way to think of it, I find, is kind of internal. So it's kind of inside the SQL 2019 Linux container. So it says run inside that container this. So basically it's going to run the SQL CMD exe and using those command strings. So if we run this, we should then get the SQL CMD command line. So if we do select ata version and go, and there you go, we now have Developer Edition 2019 on Linux running inside a Windows box. Woo! So that's all very exciting. Now, obviously there's not really a lot you can do with this. No one likes SQL CMD either. It's a bit of a pain. So we're going to do a little more exciting stuff with it. While I'm here, actually, I might as well kind of go through a couple of other kind of key Docker commands. So, just for the sake of argument, Docker Image ls, good old ls, which is the same as dir in CMD. ls is just the kind of Unix command for list. So this basically just gives me an image list from Docker. So you can actually see that's the image list I have downloaded, which is my 2019 latest. I downloaded this a long while ago, as you can tell. But that's your image list. You can do Docker PS will give you a list of your containers, and you can actually see there that these are my containers. So you can see at the end, it's kind of wrapped over, but that's because I've got my my kind of font big so that you can all see it. SQL 2019 Linux, and you can see that's the image it was built from, and you can see I created it 2 minutes ago and it's been up for 2 minutes. Now, let's kind of do something a little more funky. I'm going to clear the screen. So, what we're going to do is we're basically going to say, okay, I want to put a backup onto that box. Because it's a container, we kind of have to map it through. We can't just kind of have it access the Windows operating system. I mean, this is like a separate contained Linux. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to basically say, okay, I want you to create a directory inside. So there we go, it's my command. Docker exec internal, so inside the SQL 2019 Linux container, make directory. And I'm telling it to make the directory this. Now, I happen to know that this is where the directories are. I'll show you how I know this in a minute, but at the moment we're just going to go for this. We're going to say make directory, and we're going to make that with backups. We're going to create a backup folder, which is all good. And now what we can do is we can copy any of our backups, and I happen to have an AdventureWorks backup lying around. So if you can see here, I've got Docker copy, and this is my local path to my AdventureWorks backup. And I'm then going to copy it to the container and to that folder we've just created in the container. So nice and simple. I mean, the syntax is a bit fiddly, but you can see this is kind of a lot of copy and paste, or mimic, as the case will be, because you can't copy and paste from a video. But anyway, you can easily kind of work out what it's doing. So we're going to now copy from my local into that container. So if I hit copy, that should go through. It'll take a little while. It's not the smallest backups. And then what we're going to do while that copy's over is I am going to go to my Azure Data Studio. I could use Management Studio. I just quite like the idea of Azure Data Studio today. So I'm going to go here, and there we go. Right, now in our SQL Server, my 69. So my server is 192.168.1.69. That's the IP of my server. I mean, I've got a PowerShell window open that's running stuff, so I'll just do it from here. ipconfig, and you can see there that my IP is 192.168.1.169. So I'm going to use that. We need to ping it to port 14330, and then we're going to use SQL login, and we're going to use SA, and we're going to use my dodgy password that I created earlier. Nope. And then we're going to do connect. And what you'll find is that connects to our container. And if you see here, you will see that that has connected to Developer Edition, and it is our dodgy little name that we saw earlier, and it is Linux. So this is SQL Server on Linux, connected to via my Windows machine using Azure Data Studio in a container. Now if we ping back to our PowerShell, you can see we've now copied the backup over, which is great. So if we go to Azure Data Studio, don't know if anyone's actually used this before. If you don't have this window open and you just happen to have connections, if you right click and do manage, it will bring you to this nice little kind of funky dashboard. And then you can see here we've got restore. There's a nice big fat button on the front of our screen. So we click restore. And then basically it's very similar to kind of how you would do it in anything else. It's just drop down and fill things in. So we've got backup path, so we're going to select our backup path. We created the backup folder, which now we've copied in my AdventureWorks 2012 back, which is there. So we're going to select that. And it now fills in everything else for us. I'm not going to be too pedantic. Obviously you could script this, you could do this the proper way through to SQL. I'm just doing this kind of blunt way through the Azure Data Studio little GUI. So I'm going to hit restore, And you can see now we've got a little restore in progress. Just ticks away in the corner, shouldn't take too long. Oh, it's an exciting video when stuff's just spinning. Should be done in a second. There we go, restore succeeded. So if we now go back to our connections into databases, you can now see we have the AdventureWorks database. So right click new query, and you can see if I do select top 10 staff from sales.sales order header and run that, there we go. We now have data inside our Linux box, which is basically inside our container. So our container can now be used for testing. You can test different cardinality estimators by having different containers with different versions, boot them all up, run them as you please. The world is good. Okay, now one thing I did mention earlier is select star from sys.master files. And if I run that, you will see that all of our data is held within this directory within the Linux system. So it's var opt MS SQL data. So when I kind of created the var opt MS SQL backup, I already knew that that wasn't there, and I already knew where it was storing the data, which is in this folder, and it's always in this folder. You can specify on startup where you want the volume to kind of be tied to for the container. I haven't done that, might do that in a later video. This is just the very basics of getting it up and running with a database, which is what I've done. So the only other things left to do now are, let's clear the screen, just a few kind of notes. So we can do docker stop SQL 2019 Linux, and this is kind of the same effect really as stopping a service. So when you would normally just go to your services, see the SQL Server service running, and you would stop it, this is kind of like just shutting down the whole container. If you want to restart it again, docker start SQL 2019 Linux, and that will start it. All is good. And then if you want to actually get rid of it, so we can see here that we have our container. You can see our container is there, and it was created, and it's been up for 7 seconds because I've only just restarted it. I can now do docker stop SQL 2019 Linux again, and then that will stop it. Give it a second to power down because it's probably waiting for it to still power up. There we go. And then once you've done that, you can do docker remove, and we can actually remove it entirely. So if you're done with it, dead and buried, you don't want it anymore, it's completely gone, you can now just do docker ps, and you'll see we've got nothing. It's actually removed the container completely. So trashed it in the background, it's no longer there. If we want another, we can just boot it again from the image, just do docker run and stick in our config again, and we can just create one from scratch. But as it is, that's now gone. So not taking up space, not running, not doing anything. World is good. So yeah, that was the very, very, very quick guide to Docker, and this is probably why people wanted it in a video, not in documentation, because it's far easier to follow in this manner, even though I talk too quickly. So hopefully that was useful. For the actual written version, I do have blogs about it. Go to sqltraining.co.uk and go to the Docker blogs. Obviously, if you're on SQL Server, which would be kind of more useful, there is a SQL Server blog. And that's it. So, see you again.